I want to bring in, though, Paul Siegert, who is a managing partner at PCS Advisers, a healthcare benefits consulting firm based in Northern California. A tweet at PCS Advisers. And I understand from what I'm hearing in the news and other places, Paul, and welcome to the show, that companies are having a difficult time being able to comply with President Biden's vaccine mandate. Is that true?
Well, we are getting some feedback that that is the case. I think we actually had maybe more momentum towards mandates. 85% of employers that we talked to before the presidential announcement were saying that they intended to have a mandate in place by the end of this year. And then I think when the mandate came out from the presidential level, it put some of that on pause, ironically, just because they didn't want to invest in a mandate that they then had to rework and reissue based around the final ruling and how it gets interpreted by what comes out from OSHA likely in the next few weeks.
So what is it that is so difficult about trying to comply with it and with the mandate? Is it that there is pushback from workers? Is it that employers are trying to navigate or think ahead to any potential litigation against them on behalf of employees? Is it an issue with unions? What is the crux of the issue? I know we were talking about it in the court of public opinion. The debate goes back to the idea of, freedom of choice. It's often the phrase that it's used. But in the private sector, is it something even more nuanced?
Yeah, I think it's more practical for the smaller employers. You mentioned a lot of the issues that we're getting feedback on. One is cost of implementing the program itself. You have employers, many of whom are coming off of some very tough times, and likely there's little expectation or no expectation really that the costs will get passed on to the employees. So these employers are almost certainly going to shoulder the cost of testing and implementation and management of the program. And when you look at cost, for those smaller employers that don't necessarily have a lot of extra budget room for this, when you look at the cost of testing, inexpensive tests are $20, expensive tests are $115, and they do have a difference in the quality of the output. But even if they were on the lower end of that, and they were a 150-person employer that had, say, a third of the workforce that chooses testing over vaccines, which would kind of track with what we're seeing, then, it's a $50,000 expense just for the tests if they do the inexpensive tests, and then they're going to have to add in the management costs and implementation and administration. So a six-figure cost. And then when you think about, okay, what department's going to handle it, it's got to be HR, and raise your hand if you know an HR department that's overstaffed. They're typically understaffed. So there's a cost element, the hard cost of the testing, and then the soft cost of the work that's going to be required of HR. So that's one of the reasons that some of the smaller employers that we talk to are struggling. And then the fear, one of the things you mentioned, the staffing, fear that they may lose some key people or be unable to staff their company.
Well, that's a huge aspect of it too, right? I mean, and when you think about that, as you've said, I think people, when you hear about it, and as you mentioned, I mean, it sounds very easy on the surface, right? Okay, take a test. Then what happens? Who's paying for it? Who's not paying for it? And is there some capability or some discussion? And I really don't know. Is there some discussion about who would be required to pay for it? I mean, is this a cost that could be, borne by the actual employee, or is the expectation, generally speaking, looking around, that it is in fact going to be the employer who always has to, front the costs?
We're going to have to see what the ruling actually says when it comes out here in a few weeks. The expectation is, and it's interesting because some employers they're being encouraged to get ahead of it, and in so doing, they may have to kind of backtrack. Some are saying, we're going to put this cost on the employee. We don't want this to be convenient. We prefer they would just get vaccinated. So they at least for now, are intending to pass the cost on to the employee, although there's pretty general consensus that we expect the rule to put the cost on employers, more likely. And so then the cost issue will likely sit with employers, and then you have employers oddly enough, some in the healthcare space even who have told me that I've talked to a CEO of a smaller hospital who's sharing that he is absolutely against doing a Band-Aid because he's already at 80% staffing. He can't afford, it's not United Airlines that can afford to lose 2 or 3% of their workforce and still operate. He's has a legitimate practical concern there that he would not be able to staff his facility. So that staffing issue is a real one for some.
And you mentioned, Paul, just about the type of test that we're talking about. I know you talked about the idea of, we know there's the PCR test, there's the antigen tests, and so far, am I right, insurance companies to date have mainly paid for diagnostic testing, right? So employers have to foot the bill for the weekly or biweekly tests so far. Is there a change in the way insurance companies are also approaching this that is having a big impact on what employers are able to do and their overall considerations?
I don't expect that we'll see that. Insurance companies will likely continue on the same course that they're on today, where they will only get involved if it's for diagnostic reasons. So, that's not likely to be an opportunity to kind of push that cost along somewhere else in the system. It looks at this point that that'll stay with employers.
And is this something that is at all? Are there certain states? We know so often during the COVID-19 debates and the approaches, there's been really a patchwork of different state approaches depending upon who your governor is, what their stance has been. We see in places like Texas where there has been the fight back against requiring mandates at all. And I'm wondering, is this approach, or what companies are struggling to comply with, is it often also a patchwork based on where they are based or where their headquarters are? Or is it based on the governor? How are the rules sort of doled out? Is it state specific?
Well, that's really what we're seeing the biggest confusion around now. I think whether you agree or disagree with the Texas governor's recent order, I think we can all agree it added confusion. So you have now less certainty, which doesn't help in terms of employers navigating through this. So I think what we'll find is that based on the political leanings or preference, maybe you could say, of the employer, if they're in a state that gives some cover, while that cover may not hold up legally in the long run, they may use that as a way to kind of pick and choose which they want to go with. And right now, that's Montana and Texas are. Montana has a rule or a law really that went through their legislature, and then Texas is considering a law now. And then the governor put out his order here recently that we've all seen in the media. So we'll see. It is state by state a little bit, but there's pretty good precedent that federal mandates will supersede those. It's just going to have to get played out in the courts.
Well, we will see. It's hard for, I know companies like to be able to predict, and oftentimes while we're in, I often hear the phrase of Q1 and Q2 and Q4, and they're already, right, quarters ahead for the last person thinking about it. And, predictability is something that is obviously the friend of business, but we're in really uncertain times about these very issues and concerns. Is it different, by the way? I know you're a managing partner at PCS Advisers, a healthcare benefits consulting firm, and I'm wondering, in the healthcare space specifically, we are seeing a lot that hospitals and medical providers obviously are faced with the same issues regarding vaccine mandates, and there being some members of the staff who may in fact also be reluctant or refusing and go with the testing route instead of vaccination route. Are you seeing a difference between how the private sector is operating and responding and the medical community?
Well, interestingly, before the presidential announcement, we saw some in the medical community. Kettering Health in Ohio is a good example of this, that we're starting to add some accommodations into their mandate that allowed for natural immunity, which was an interesting trend that was starting. I don't expect that we'll see that in the OSHA ruling that comes out, but that was something that was happening, and and there's a lot of basis for that, and that's been the basis for some of the objections that some of these folks have. I'd say we see it more the difference in how it's handled, we're seeing more based on size of employer almost than anything else. The larger you are, I think the more resilient those companies are and the bigger budget they have to deal with all of this. And that's United, back to United, is a good example of that. They had the 400 to 500 that were terminated, but they had another 2,000 that had filed for and gotten exemptions from United, but they then said those that got religious exemptions, as an example, were going to be put on unpaid leave. And they have 67,000 employees, so that's something that they could manage their way through. And the smaller employers are, I think, hanging back more so in implementing this because of the challenges that they'll face at a real practical level once it gets implemented.
This is such an important conversation, and one I appreciate having with you, Paul Siegert, Managing Partner at PCS Advisers, a healthcare benefits consulting firm based in Northern California. You know, it's good to get the nitty-gritty details about actually how these mandates will, in fact, work in the long run. Thanks for your time, Paul. I appreciate it.